Hey everyone, new tutorial here, and this one is specifically going to be on how I use multiply layers in shading. Some people do say that it's wrong to use them, it's bad, and I can understand why that is said. The way that multiply layers work aren't technically how things are shaded, but there are workarounds for that, and I will be showing my kind of overly complicated process for getting around that. This process is quite specific to, again, how I do things, but I can't really teach it any other way because this is how I do things. If you're interested in doing this yourself, by all means adopt the process, and hopefully you'll at least find it a bit interesting and maybe learn something about how light works, because I work on, despite having quite stylized work, I do try and work on the art fundamentals and find ways to make my anime art more technically correct. So this might be useful to some of you out there. Apologies in advance, I am sick at the minute. Hopefully that doesn't come through too much in the recordings. I will do my best to edit it out if it does, but yeah, so. Getting into it, this is basically how I shade things. This won't be covering ambient occlusion, that is a separate job that I do, and I already have a tutorial on that, which I will link in the description. It's a bit long and rambly, but it explains that process there. For this one, I will just be going into the shading and the rendering outside of that. So I have something quite rough here. It works, so it will do the job fine for this tutorial. It is an OC of mine who is featuring in an upcoming visual novel. I don't quite know when it will be finished. So what I have currently is a folder that's set to multiply, and inside of that there is one single layer that is using a gray value with no color, it's just gray, and I've gone in and blocked out all of the shadows. There's another one here I'll remove this for now actually, for the background, because I don't want it to get confusing. So it's all blocked in shape-wise, there isn't much variation, and it all looks a bit grey and dead. But okay, so first of all I should probably explain how multiply layers work. I think most people are pretty comfortable using them and are familiar with them, but maybe don't know the technicalities and how it actually works on a color theory basis. I don't really know how to word that right, but so if I can just file new, okay. So most people are well aware that when you use multiply layers, they add the values together. So let me just draw some red here, and then let's take some, actually this will be a bad example, let me just take more of a pink. And then using multiply, let me just shift the hue, and let's do this. Okay, I'll just also make the background white, just so there's no confusion. What happens here is these two colors that are then overlaid on top of each other with a multiply layer are then added together. So you take the value and the hue, the saturation, and you add that together with the other value. So as most of you probably know, when using multiply layers, basically they add the two colors together. And on a technical level, what that means is that they add both the saturation, the value, and the hue together, all three properties of the color. And what it leads to is a darker, more saturated version of by combining the two colors. And that isn't how shadows work in the real world. The way light and color sort of work is that light brings out color. So you are never going to have shadows that are more saturated than the things that aren't in shadow. And there are some small exceptions to this, which I will be going over a little bit later on, but basically, for the most part, that is how things work. The only exceptions being translucent objects, and that comes from the light passing through the object and bouncing around and saturating it that way. So ignoring that just for now, that is how I want to use multiply layers. I want to combine the values so you get a darker value, but I do not want the saturation, because the saturation for the shadows is incorrect for the most part. And that is, I will try to get around that. So if you were to just go in and paint using only multiply layers, all of your shadows will be more saturated than the highlights and the midtones, and you don't want that. How to get around that is actually fairly simple. So as I said, the only layer here is gray. All I have done is added value. I have not fucked with the colors at all. The colors are exactly the same. Same hue for everything. As you can see, crossing into the shadow and the highlight there is no change on the color part of the color wheel. But of course, this looks pretty darn dead, and we don't want that, we want pretty colors. And the way to do that, this is where it gets kind of confusing and complicated. You, first of all, hide everything but the flat colors, merge it to one single layer. Okay, wait, not like that. Okay, no, yeah, it'll be like that, actually. Yep, and then move that into the same folder as the shadows. And it looks kind of weird at first, but then you take it, clip it down onto the shadows so it only shows through in the shadows. And then we're going to go to tonal correction, hue, that one, or whatever equivalent. If you're using Cyan Photoshop, you can do that on any program. And then invert the hue to, you know, do a complete 180. And what this does, because you're adding two colors together, if the color is the complete opposite, it ends up subtracting saturation. So now these shadows are less saturated than the original, the original flat colors. And this doesn't look quite right. It looks a bit, well, it's way too dark for a start. Then I turn it down to about anywhere from 20 to 30% opacity. It doesn't have to be a lot, but what it does is it takes a bit of saturation out of the shadows even more. So you're now left with, you know, all of your shadows desaturated. It still looks a bit dead though, doesn't it? So we then have to go in and tweak some things and bring the image some more color and some more life. And for that, the two main things that I do go and change afterwards are the skin and the hair. The hair being a bit more of a stylized thing, you can kind of avoid that. Hair is actually naturally very reflective. It can have a lot of hue variation in it, so you can get away with a lot there. With skin is actually a little bit translucent, and so it brings back to that property I was talking about before about how when an object is translucent, light passes through it, and the technical term for this is subsurface scattering. And if you give me a second, I will look this up. I should have done this previously. Okay, so here is a 3D render example. It's, of course, not realistic. It is a bit pushed, but it shows my point pretty darn clear that, hey look, the skin absorbs light and it comes through much more saturated. So for this specifically, we can get away with it. What I will do is new layer, clip that on as well, and then I'll take the skin value, I will tweak it a bit. I will take it about, I'll make it a bit more redder, and I will drop the value a little bit just to make sure it stays quite dark. And then I'll just go in, I'll paint over it like this. I'll then usually turn it down to an unspecified amount. And then usually tweak the hair a bit too, just because I can, and reflective light is always good. And then also like to bring in what's known as, it's different from ambient occlusion because it's actual occlusion. It is not a trick, a 3D trick. It's a thing that exists in real life, and that is, I believe the term is dynamic occlusion. I've only studied it a little bit, but I found that if you gradiate your shadows, it looks nicer. Because light is very complex, and it's rare to have the exact same value absolutely everywhere, especially when it is reflective and bounced and all of that. So then just taking the airbrush tool and going in with black and white and just adjusting your shadows to sort of match the mood of the image a bit better. And with that, that is pretty much my process for just the shadow side of things. I will link the tutorial for the ambient occlusion because this is really half of my rendering process for the most part. Oh, and actually, before I go, let me just quickly show you what each layer adds and just sort of go through it step by step, because altogether maybe you won't have quite seen the difference. So with the inverted hues, it makes quite a big difference to how much the shadows stand out, and the contrast there is definitely important. Contrast is a pretty big element of art in general, and the more ways you can find to work it in, the better. Definitely the change in hue of some areas, very important. It makes Alex look a lot less dead. And then the dynamic occlusion definitely sort of pushes some areas out of focus and brings more attention to others, I think. I don't really want people focusing on his crotch or anything. But yeah, other than that, that's pretty much it. I hope this was somewhat interesting, and maybe you learned something a little bit about light. If you have any questions, please let me know. I will do my best to answer them. I'm still kind of a student myself, but I do notice that artists who do use multiply layer do tend to get a bit of flack for it, and I don't think that's completely fair. There are ways around it, as I've tried to show today. So yeah, thank you for watching.